Greetings to each one of you in the name of Jesus, and special welcome to those of you that are visiting today. We are continuing in a series that I started last Sunday because I was confronted with the subject of Sabbath keeping, and after that happened, there's probably, I don't know why this happened, but there's probably few subjects that I have been confronted with that caused me to, the thoughts to just pour in and pour in and pour in. My head was way too full. And I told you that I wanted to preach this in two parts. And unfortunately today I can't finish what I would like to say in two parts. I feel embarrassed about that. I'm not sure all that extra stuff. What is the right answer? Is God giving this to me because he knows you need it? Or is it my problem that I just collect too much information and then don't know what to do with it? I won't even get into Sunday worship today, which is always part of the question, what about Saturday? What about Sunday? But what I want to get into today is, this is called Sabbath Keeping on Trial. In fact, maybe we want to turn these lights out right here. It might help for you to be able to see. Sabbath Keeping on Trial, Part 2, Conclusions from the New Covenant. And so, Sunday keeping, and there's a number of other things that I would cover in a third part if I should. But I'm going to leave it this way. I'll do it by request, okay? If you think it's important, if I hear from people, I'll preach that third part sometime in the future, my next turn. But if I don't hear anything, I'll assume that I need to condense things more. That's the right answer. So we'll leave it like that. Okay, but the reason that as I looked into the new covenant, there is so much. You see, like I said last time, this really, if you're wanting to find the right answer from the word Sabbath, it's a little bit picking and choosing, and you got to really dig to find out and try to put all the pieces together. But if the right answer has to do with the covenants, there is piles and piles and piles of information to help us to answer the question. So this question about Sabbath keeping, is it binding in the New Testament? Sabbatarians will tell you, this is what I said last Sunday, if Jesus kept the Sabbath and Paul kept the Sabbath and the Bible nowhere commands to cease observing the Sabbath, and we know that we should obey God's commandments, why do you disobey the Sabbath by worshiping on Sunday? I know some of you are here for the first time today. By the way, that term, Sabbatarian, is not a derogatory term. I said this last Sunday, but it's just, there's different brands, if you want to say, of Sabbath observers. Some are Seventh-day Adventists who basically just carry the Sabbath day over from the Old Covenant. But there are others out there that do all kinds of other things too. They're observing diets, they're observing certain feasts, certain days. So I just lump them all together and I'll say a Sabbatarian. All right, so we concluded last Sunday that the answer is not found just in studying the word Sabbath, but rather in studying the two covenants. The question is, which one are we living under? We're either living under one or the other. And according to Romans 7, you cannot have parts of two covenants in place at one time. So if we understand the covenants, we will understand, I believe, what to do with the Sabbath. Now, the Sabbatarians, to make their case for Sabbath keeping today, they make, I believe, their strongest argument from the Old Testament. But when they try to use the New Testament to make their case, their argument becomes very weak. In fact, there is only one verse in the entire New Testament that speaks of the Sabbath in any prescriptive way. And that verse actually says not to let people judge us for not observing the Sabbath. We're going to look at that verse later. Sabbath keepers cannot find one verse prescribing Sabbath keeping in the New Testament. And so, New Testament doctrine is established by prescription. You know what I mean by prescription? I mean that it has been prescribed like a doctor, right? He writes the order. You don't just assume that what medicine you ought to take, but you take what has been prescribed. Is that how you do it? That's how I do it when I go to the doctor. You cannot assume part of the old covenant carries over unless it is stated in the new. And that's my argument, okay? So in this message, we will look at three questions. Number one, how is the new covenant different from the old? Number two, in what way did Jesus fulfill the law and the Ten Commandments? He said, I did not come to destroy, but to, what did he say? Fulfill. Okay, then in what way did he do that? We want to try to answer that question today. And then number three, if it's fulfilled, if it's all fulfilled, then it all goes away. In fact, I would love to put this slide up, but I don't have time. But Matthew 5, verse 18. We looked at that verse last Sunday. I think it undoes their case completely. That verse is basically saying, Jesus says there, until heaven and earth pass, not one jot or one tittle from the law will pass until all is fulfilled. So what it's saying is, you can't have none of it fulfilled. You can't have part of it fulfilled. But what it's saying is, when it is fulfilled, all the jots and tittles will all go away. To me, that's what that verse is clearly saying. If that is what Jesus was telling us when he said that in Matthew 5, verse 18, then, question 3, do we see other New Testament evidence confirming this claim, that Old Testament law and Sabbath keeping is superseded and replaced in the New Covenant? All right, so I'm going to invite you to turn. I'm going to have a lot of scripture up on the screen here, but I'm going to invite you to turn to Hebrews chapter 8 as we begin the message for a text this morning. So again, the title today is Sabbath Keeping on Trial, Part 2, Conclusions from the New Covenant. Hebrews chapter 8. Now, I'm just going to read through the chapter, but we're going to pause and hit a few highlights along the way. Now, of the things which we have spoken, this is the sum. Hebrews is comparing old and new, right? Old covenant and new. It talks about the old tabernacle and the new. All right, so that's what he begins this chapter with. We have such an high priest who is set on the right hand of the throne of the majesty in the heavens. So Aaron was a high priest in the old, but we have this other high priest in a different place. He is the minister of the sanctuary and of the true tabernacle. You see that? Not the old, but the true, which the Lord pitched and not man. God made this tabernacle in heaven. He's saying, I'm not talking about the one on the earth. For every high priest, and I would say on earth, verse 3, is ordained to offer gifts and sacrifices. Wherefore it is of necessity that this man have somewhat also to offer. For if he were on earth, he should not be a priest, seeing that there are priests that offer gifts according to the law, who serve unto the example and shadow of heavenly things. As Moses was admonished of God when he was about to make the tabernacle, for see, saith he, that thou make all things according to the pattern showed to thee in the mount. That would be the Mount of Sinai. So when God told Moses how to build the tabernacle, it was by a certain pattern of something that already existed in heaven, is what he's saying. And what's interesting is the tangible thing that you could see with your naked eye is the tabernacle is called actually the shadow. The old is the shadow. The thing you can't see is the substance. That's what verse 5 says, the shadow. All right, now we come to verse 6. But now hath he obtained a more excellent ministry,
by how much also he is the mediator of a better covenant, which was established upon better promises. Jesus' covenant, we talked about this last Sunday, it's based upon his own blood. Luke 22, verse 20, this cup, Jesus did establish a new covenant, and it says it again right here in verse 6. He said in Luke 22, verse 20, this cup is the New Testament, or the new covenant, in my blood. All right, the old covenant was started with the blood of bulls and goats. Now he says, my blood. The new covenant is established by his words. John 14:23, if a man love me, he will keep my words and my commandments. John 14, verse 15, if you love me, keep my commandments. My blood, my words, my commandments, my covenant. Verse 7, if that first covenant had been faultless, then there should no place have been sought for a second. For finding fault with them, he saith, behold, the days come, saith the Lord, when I will make a new covenant. Now, verse 8 down to verse 11, I believe it is, verse 12 actually, is actually a prophecy. This is a quote, a direct quote out of Jeremiah. See, God was talking about the new covenant even in the Old Testament. The day is coming, God said this in the Old, that I will make a new covenant with the house of Israel and with the house of Judah, not according to the covenant that I made with their fathers in the day when I took them by the hand to lead them out of the land of Egypt, because they continued not in my covenant, and I regarded them not, saith the Lord. For this is the covenant that I will make, verse 10, with the house of Israel after those days, saith the Lord. I will put my laws into their mind and write them on tables of stone? No. I will write them in their hearts. And I will be to them a God, and they shall be to me a people. Now, down in verse 13 yet, I'll read that yet. In that he saith, a new covenant, he hath made the first old. The King James says old. The New King James says obsolete. In that he saith, a new covenant, he hath made the first obsolete. And he goes on and says, at the end of that verse, now that which decayeth and waxeth old is ready to vanish away. The writer of Hebrews, I think it was the Apostle Paul, we don't know for sure, but to me he is clearly saying here that when the new covenant comes in, the old one becomes obsolete. It vanishes away. All right. Now, let's look at our first question. Jesus said in the upper room, I told you this last Sunday, he sat down there with his disciples and he says, this is the new covenant in my blood. Did they have any idea what he was talking about? And then, so what makes the new covenant distinct or different from the old? And I think it's very simple, actually. But it is the law of love. So we have the law of Moses, the law of Christ. The term law of Christ is used in the New Testament, but it is a law of love. John 13, verse 34, Jesus said, a new commandment I give to you. Now, Sabbatarians would have to say, with this verse, they would have to say, okay, I gave you the 10 commandments, keep keeping those, and now I'm going to give you an additional commandment. But that's not what he said. He said, I give you a new commandment, that ye love one another. So the law of Christ is the law of love. And he repeats this, and he shows, he's showing here how if we keep the law of love, then we keep the old law as well. Or it covers everything moral that speaks of God's moral will in the old covenant. The golden rule, Matthew 7, verse 12. Therefore all things, whatsoever ye would, that men should do to you, do ye even so to them, for this is the law and the prophets. So in other words, if you treat others like you want to be treated, you're fulfilling the law. And Jesus So when Jesus fulfilled the law, we also fulfill the old when we follow his commandments, this law of love. The great commandments, Matthew 22, verse 36. A man came to Jesus and he asked him, Master, what is the great commandment in the law? Is it one of the 10? Which one is it? Is it the first one of the 10? We don't have a record that he said it exactly that way, but he knew all those commandments. And so he asked Jesus which was the greatest one. And we know what Jesus said. Jesus said unto him, Thou shalt love. This is the law of Christ. It's the law of love. Thou shalt love the Lord thy God with all thy heart and with all thy soul and with all thy mind. This is the first and great commandment. And the second is like unto it, Thou shalt love thy neighbor as thyself. On these two commandments hang all the law and the prophets. So I think, when Jesus was saying, I didn't come to destroy, I came to fulfill, this is what he's getting at. When you follow my law or my way, it covers everything that's been stated. In fact, it goes beyond. The law of Christ is the law of love. Now, let's define love just a little bit more. And I want us to ask ourselves this morning, okay? Most of you, nearly all of you that are here today are Christians already, right? You follow a law, but is it a law of righteousness or is it a love of righteousness? Is that the kind of Christianity you have? And does it have some of these qualities here? What kind of love are we talking about? So when Jesus said that he fulfilled the law, he fulfilled it with love. That's how he did it. He did it with love. And what kind of love? It is, first of all, there could be many other words put down here, but I have three. First of all, a sacrificial love. Greater love hath no man than this, than a man lay down his life for his friends. So as a Christian, is the love that I have for God, those two commandments that he said, all the law and the prophets hang from that, the love that you have for God and for others, is it to this extent? Is it a sacrificial love? This is how the new covenant is different from the old. You see, you don't see this in the Old Testament like we see it in Jesus' new covenant. It's sacrificial. Secondly, it is voluntary. Voluntary. When Jesus fulfilled the law, when he did his Father's will, therefore doth my Father love me, because I lay down my life that I might take it again. No man taketh it from me, but I lay it down of myself, he said. I'm not doing what I have to do. I'm not doing just the bare minimum of what I have to do. I'm going above and beyond. I'm volunteering to do. He says, no man taketh it from me, but I lay it down of myself. I have power to lay it down, and I have power to take it again. This commandment I've received from my Father. You see, as a Christian, if we're a law Christian, we're looking for what are the limits? Like, once we reach the speed limit, so to speak, then we'll just stop right there. But the law of Christ is looking for opportunities and not for limits. If I find myself just looking for the limits, then I'm still sort of living the law type of Christianity. Does that make sense? All right. Sacrificial. This is the kind of love that Jesus' new covenant requires. Sacrificial, voluntary, and last of all, limitless. And I guess I kind of covered that already. I spoke about limits. Law looks for what is required. Law looks for the limits of my responsibility. But in Galatians 5, verse 22, it says, the fruit of the Spirit, love, joy, peace, long-suffering, gentleness, goodness, faith, meekness, temperance. Against such there is no law. There is no limit. Nobody's going to say, hey, that's just a little too much love. A little too much joy, you've reached the limits. We're going to have to, you're capped out here. No, love is limitless. So, I know some of you asked me last Sunday, I made the statement that I don't think any of the old covenant it carries over.
Okay, the Sabbatarians have to carry over to make their brand of Christianity work. They have to pick a piece out of the old and carry it over into the new. Okay, I just think we get in trouble when we do that. But we are a little bit uncertain about saying, well, but what about the Ten Commandments? What about not killing and stealing? And that probably should carry over, right? So I'll just tell you where I'm at. I prefer not to say that the Ten Commandments carry over. But the reason I say that is because that's the law of righteousness, so to speak. But when you have the love or the law of Christ, which is the love of Christ, when you have that mixed into those commands, it actually becomes a different substance, is the way I think of it. So I think all of our New Testament morality is found in the New Testament. Can we learn from the Old? Yes, we can learn from the Old. Are we still not supposed to kill and steal? Of course. But if you keep those two commandments like Jesus said, then you have kept all the law and the prophets. So we're aiming for the law of Christ and not the law of Moses. That's my understanding. All right. Now, I think I jumped ahead of myself and covered some of what I want to say next. But so here's another thing that I just want to explain. I'm not very good at doing PowerPoint diagrams. But this is part of why I say what I just did, that I don't think the Ten Commandments carry over into the New, because the Ten Commandments would be like the man on the left. This law that God gave, those 10. Remember what happened when he gave the Ten Commandments? There was thunder, there was lightning. The people were so afraid they said, Moses, you go up there and talk to God. We don't even want to go up there. We're too afraid. And then God spoke to Moses, and Moses told the people. The law of Moses was imposed from the outside in. Thou shalt not. Thou shalt do this, and thou shalt not do that. That's how it is. If you're living under the old covenant, that's kind of how it is with people at work. I mean, that's how they do it at work, right? The policeman, that's what he uses too. And that's the same thing that the old covenant does. They impose the law from the outside in. Thou shalt not. All right? But when Christ comes in, Romans 5 verse 5 says, the love of God is shed abroad in our hearts. So there's a seed of love planted in the heart. And now out of the life, instead of the direction being the law comes down and it's flowing into my life this way, now it's love is in the center and it's flowing out that way. So if I'm in the new covenant, my life, the flow is going like this. It's in here and it goes out. Now, if I am keeping the Ten Commandments out of this over here on the right side, then it's because I'm under the law of Christ. Not because I'm over there on the other side and this thing has been imposed down upon me. All right. In what way did Jesus fulfill the law and the Ten Commandments? He said in Matthew 5 verse 17, I did not come to destroy, but to fulfill. Well, the first one is easy. He fulfilled the ceremonial law. Remember all the sacrifices and all that. That's the part we think of. When we read that Jesus fulfilled the law, we think of that, all the other sacrifices went away. And that is very true. He did. That is how he fulfilled that. There's no more sacrifices that are necessary. Hebrews 9, 14 and 15. How much more shall the blood of Christ, who through the eternal Spirit offered himself without spot to God, purge your conscience from dead works to serve the living God? And for this cause, he is the mediator of the New Testament or the New Covenant. How else did Jesus fulfill, let's say, the Ten Commandments? All right, well, I believe that he fulfilled the first three of the Ten Commandments. So the first three of the Ten Commandments have to do with God and pleasing God. Those three are, have no other gods before me. Thou shalt not make unto thee any graven image. Thou shalt not take the name of the Lord thy God in vain. I believe that he fulfilled those first three by keeping the first and the great commandment. And it is the same for us. He is the pattern. So when we keep the first commandment, these three are fulfilled. These three are obsolete because we're living by the first commandment, the greatest one of all. And he fulfilled the last six
of the 10, which is all the thou shalt nots, all right? When he kept the second of the great commandments. Romans 13, verse 8 says, "Owe no man anything but to love one another. For he that loveth another hath fulfilled the law." Just like Jesus. Same for us. For this, and then he goes on and explains a little more, verse 9. "For this, thou shalt not commit adultery, all the thou shalt not kill, thou shalt not steal, thou shalt not bear false witness, thou shalt not covet. And if there be any other commandment," it is briefly comprehended. It's all summed up in this one saying, namely this: "Thou shalt love thy neighbor as thyself. Love worketh no ill to his neighbor. Therefore, love is the fulfilling of the law." That's how we fulfill the 10 Commandments, folks. It's by filling the top 2 commandments of Christ, the law of Christ. That's how we do it. Now, what about the 4th commandment? We covered 9. The Seventh-day Adventists will tell you that, but the Sabbath. All right, what about that one? How did Jesus fulfill the Sabbath commandment? I believe it is by the offering of himself. I was listening to a sermon by Leo Eby, who studied Sabbath keeping and the different scriptures and trying to piece this all together for 10 years, he told me. Didn't know this man until 2 weeks ago. I listened to a sermon that he preached, and then we had several different phone calls with him. And he said that one of the things that he found in his study was he was reading a book by a Jewish rabbi. And in the book, somebody asked the rabbi, did Jesus take anything away from the old law? He was trying to get this rabbi to accept Jesus. And so he was asking him, well, what harm did Jesus do? Did he take anything away from the law? And the rabbi said, no. He said, did he add anything to the law? And the rabbi said, yes. What did he add? He added himself. That was what the rabbi found offensive. And that is why he is not going to believe in Jesus, because Jesus added himself. And can you imagine me standing up here this morning and telling you all, remember how the people were so amazed when they heard Jesus and they said, man, nobody ever spoke like this man, and the Pharisees were offended? Why? Well, can you imagine me standing up here this morning and say, hey, you all, come unto me. Why don't you just come to me? Some of you are struggling this last week. Just come unto me, and I will give you rest. What audacity for a human being to say something like that. But that is what Jesus did. He said, come unto me. Hebrews 4 verse 3 says, for we which have believed do enter into rest. And Jesus says, come unto me, all ye that labor and are heavy laden, and I will give you rest. The Sabbath rest in the New Testament is not a day. I think Sunday observation is good, and we could talk about that in the other sermon if we get to it. But I think more the answer is of how the Sabbath day was fulfilled is not that it got transferred over to Sunday. It got transferred to Jesus Christ himself. This is how you find your rest. It's not in a day, it's a person. This is how Jesus fulfilled the Sabbath. And this is why it's fulfilled, folks. We don't need to be worshiping on the Sabbath day. All right, now, if it's all fulfilled, is there evidence in the New Testament that supports this conclusion? Is there evidence in the rest of the New Testament that Old Testament law and Sabbath keeping is superseded and replaced in the New Covenant? Now, I said this last Sunday, but I'll say it again. When you read through the New Testament, when it uses the term law, many times it will say the works of the law. But when it speaks of law, it is not just saying, well, what I mean is the moral law. Or, no, this time I mean the ceremonial law. No, this time I mean the 10 Commandments. It's just a simple term that encompasses, it's everything. He's just talking about everything.
He's not saying, when Paul, especially Paul writes about this, he's not saying now, just so you know, the Sabbath now, that still pertains. When I say law, I just mean everything else. That nowhere is stated in the New Testament. It just includes all of it. So I would like for us now, in the last few minutes of the message, we're just going to look at the Bible, okay? We're going to look and see, okay, there's not a lot in the New Testament that talks about Sabbath. There's a few places. But what does it say about the law, which the Sabbath is included in it? This isn't near everything that I found, but it is enough. To me, I found it very persuasive. Let's look first of all at Romans. Romans 10, verse 4. Very simple. Christ is the end of the law for righteousness. Okay. In the Old Testament, the old way was ceremonies, diets, feasts, Sabbath keeping. That was the law for righteousness. Paul says Christ is the end of that. All right, that gives us one clue of what Paul thought about it. What about 1 Corinthians? 1 Corinthians 9, verse 20 and 21. Very interesting verses here. Paul is talking in this passage about his strategy for winning converts. He didn't care who he witnessed to, right? Anybody. Jews, non-Jews, black, green, didn't matter what color, what race, anybody. He says, under the Jews, I become as a Jew, that I might gain the Jews. Now, I think there, he's probably talking about Jews that were not, Torah observant. They were just, this is their national language, but they're not religious. So when I'm with them, I become like them to gain them. And then he goes on and says, to them that are under the law, as under the law. So what he's telling us here is he himself, Paul, is not under the law, but when he's with them, he observes as them so as to not be an offense to them. To them that are without law, as without law. So like the Gentiles, they don't have any of this Torah stuff. But then he goes on and clarifies at the end of verse 21, being not without law to God, he's saying, I'm not lawless. Just because I'm not under the Ten Commandments or the Old Covenant. No, I'm not lawless, but rather under the law of Christ, that I might gain them that are without law. So here in this passage, he actually distinguishes the old law and the new. And he's saying, I'm not under the old. Paul is clearly telling us this right here. He distinguishes the Old Testament law from the law of Christ. All right. Now, let's go to Galatians. What does Paul say to them? See, we're looking here, if I'm a Sabbatarian, I'm looking for some kind of directive, some kind of prescription, all right, that verifies that I need to carry this over. Somebody told me this, and so we're looking to see if we have any confirmation of that. I'm not finding it so far. This is what he says in Galatians. O foolish Galatians, who hath bewitched you, that ye should not obey the truth, before whose eyes Jesus Christ hath been evidently set forth, crucified among you. This only would I learn of you. Received ye the Spirit by the works of the law, or by the hearing of faith? It's a rhetorical question. He's saying, did you get born again by the old or by the Spirit? Of course it's by the Spirit. Are you so foolish? Having begun in the Spirit, are ye now made perfect by the flesh? I just want to pause here and say something. You know, some people say, what does it matter? If somebody wants to worship on Thursday, so what? If they want to worship on Saturday, so what? Does it really matter? And in a sense, I would say, yeah, so what? It doesn't really matter. Go ahead and observe Saturday if you want to. But here's the thing, and here's the warning that Paul is giving us. You see, people that do that, they say, oh, this is a secondary, I was told this is a secondary issue. But you talk about it long enough and you realize this is not a secondary issue. If you're not doing it, you might not be ending up in heaven when you die. It has a way, when you start adding to the law of Christ by dragging other stuff across, you think you're doing yourself a favor, making yourself more righteous, but in the end, it distracts from the law of Christ. It becomes doing it for righteousness, not doing it for preference. See, doing it for preference, I think, is okay. Not doing it for righteousness. And so many of the ones that are doing it for righteousness. That is what Paul is saying. That is not okay. You may not do it for righteousness. And that's why he warns them. He says, don't go back. See, the Galatians, I don't know if they were Jews or Gentiles, but they got converted, and the Judaizers came in and said, you need to do this, you need to do this. And Paul says, wait a minute, no, don't do that. Galatians 3, verse 10. Galatians is loaded with this, by the way. For as many as are of the works of the law, he says, are under the curse. For it is written, cursed is everyone that continueth not in all things which are written in the book of the law. All things. Isn't that interesting? Seventh-day Adventists want to just carry the Sabbath over, but not the rest. But he says, no, all things. If you're going to do that, you're obligated to do all things. Galatians 3, verse 24 and 25. Wherefore the law was our schoolmaster to bring us unto Christ, that we might be justified by faith. But after that faith has come, we are no longer under a schoolmaster. You know, if we're no longer under the schoolmaster, which is another way of saying the old covenant, why would the old part of the old covenant be binding? Does that make any sense? It doesn't make any sense to me. And another one in Galatians chapter 4, verse 9. But now after that ye have known God, he just continues warning, or rather are known of God, how turn ye again to the weak and beggarly elements, whereunto ye desire again to be in bondage? And he goes on and says, ye observe days and months and times and years. I am afraid of you, the King James says, New King James says, I am afraid for you. I'm afraid for you if you do this. Lest I have bestowed upon you labor in vain. This is what Steve Gregg said. I watched a number of his videos about this. And he says, I think there's a tendency with people who get bored with Jesus to look for something to add to their Christianity. They don't want to abandon Jesus, but they want something new, some new pizzazz to add to their Christianity, and they get distracted by things they think are going to add to their Christian experience. All right, let's just keep going quickly through the rest. Ephesians 2, verse 15. Having abolished in his flesh the enmity, even the law of commandments. Now, Seventh-day Adventists will say, the ceremonial went away, but not the Ten Commandments. But he says right here, even the law of commandments contained in ordinances. This has been abolished. Philippians 3, verse 9. And be found in him, not having my own righteousness, which is of the law, but that which is through the faith of Christ. Let's jump to Colossians. And here he even says, I'll just go down to verse 16. And this is the one verse I mentioned in the opening. Let no man therefore judge you in meat or in drink or in respect of any holy day or of the new moon or of the Sabbath day. Don't let anybody judge you for this. Now I asked a Sabbatarian friend, I said, well, what would you make? I said, how do you understand Colossians 2? And he said, well, that means, if I observe the Sabbath, you shouldn't judge me for doing it. Well, that's clearly not what the passage is saying. It's saying it exactly the opposite way. It is saying if you stop observing Sabbath now that you're a Christian, don't let those Judaizers judge you for not doing it anymore. That's what it's saying. All right. And now, I want you to turn with me. I'm going to look at one more scripture, okay? 2 Corinthians chapter 3. I think this is the clincher. I'd love to just camp on this chapter, but we can't. This is the clincher. If I only could pick one passage to bring out that clearly says about the old and new, the new covenant. And even it mentions the Ten Commandments right here in 2 Corinthians chapter 3. All right, where shall I just jump in here? I guess I'll just jump in at verse 6. Who also hath made us able ministers of the New Testament, or other translations say, the new covenant, not of the letter, but of the Spirit. For the letter killeth, but the Spirit giveth life. Now,
remember I told you that the Sabbatarians will say, yeah, but the stuff that was written on the letters was the stuff Moses wrote down. Remember, Moses wrote some and God wrote some. Remember that? Moses wrote down in the book of the law, but God wrote the 10 on stone. So, the stuff written in the book went away, but not the stuff on stone. Well, what does it say in verse 7? But if the ministration of death, written and engraven in stones. I think he's talking about the Ten Commandments, folks. What if that was glorious, so that the children of Israel could not steadfastly behold the face of Moses, for the glory of his countenance, which glory was to be done away. Now, this King James English, I have a hard time reading it sometimes because it sounds kind of convoluted. I'll read down to verse 10 and then explain a little bit. How shall not the ministration of the Spirit be rather glorious? For if the ministration of condemnation be glory, much more doth the ministry of righteousness exceed in glory. For even that which was made glorious had no glory in this respect by reason of the glory that excelleth. All right, what is he talking about here? Let's see here. Let me back up one. All right, he's saying, remember when Moses went up in the mountain and he was with God and it was so amazing that his face glowed? Remember that? But he put a veil over his face because he didn't want the people to see the glory was going to fade away, right? It was a temporary glory. It was glorious, but it was temporary. He's comparing that to the Old Covenant. He says the Old Covenant, but he calls it the ministration of death. He says that was glorious, but it also, just like Moses' face, is temporary and it's fading away. Because there's another glory coming that excelleth. And it's a little bit like when I got up this morning, went outside, the moon was shining. And the moon is still, if we could see with the right kind of glasses, we could probably still see it. But the moon all went away. Why? Because the sun came up, right? Same way. When the sun came up, Jesus, it's the glory that excelleth. All right? That's what he's telling us here. And in verse 11, let's see. There's a word. I'm just going to go through this real quick and then we're going to close. In verse 7, it says, which glory was to be done away. All right, that's Moses' face and the ministration of death. This is to be done away. Verse 11 says, for if that which is done away. Verse 13 says, and not as Moses, which put a veil over his face, that the children of Israel could not steadfastly look at the end of that which is abolished. And then down in verse 14, it says, done away. These are all done away, abolished, or all this word, I don't know if I can say it, Katarago. It means to render idle, to be inactive, to be inoperative. See, these words all, it's saying this about Moses' face, and it's saying this about the Old Covenant. To cease, to cause to cease, to put to an end, to do away with, to annul, or to abolish. That is what Paul is clearly saying happens to Moses' face and to the Old Covenant, including the Ten Commandments. The ministration of death, all right? Because something is coming that is more glorious, all right? Now, somebody might say, but I thought Jesus, this sounds like he's destroying the law. I thought he was fulfilling the law. Well, 1 Corinthians 13, verse 11, Paul said, when I was a child, I spake as a child. I understood as a child. I thought as a child. But when I became a man, I put away, and that's actually the same word as we just read, that katargego, I can't even say it. I put away childish things. One of the things that Steve Gregg said is when a child becomes a man, he is not destroyed. You know, when William grows up, when he's 22, we're not going to say, oh man, you destroyed the little boy. No, he's fulfilled, right? He's still there. All right.
In closing this morning, is it reasonable to say that after all Paul's warnings about the works of the law and observing days, that what he meant was the Sabbath is still binding, even though it is not mentioned even once in the New Testament? Or is it more reasonable to say the old covenant, which included the Ten Commandments, has passed away? It is no longer binding. Instead, the new covenant is in place, as the New Testament so clearly and plainly seems to be saying. I think the answer is obvious. Christ established a new covenant that was based on love, not on law. Does Jesus have commandments? Absolutely he does. Certainly he does. But they flow from love of Christ and not the law of Moses. My friend Leo Eby that I mentioned, who has studied extensively on this subject, has on his WhatsApp contact page, is your Sabbath a day or a person? So I believe that rest in Jesus, present and future, is the fulfillment of the Old Testament Sabbath. If we go into another message, we will talk about the Sunday worship and some the witness of the early spirit. And I would like to, there was a couple questions that came in from the congregation that I would put into that sermon if the Lord so leads.